Sharma. I'm very grateful to be called, and my thanks to my friend for introducing the debate and to all the petitioners who've brought this very important matter to the House. And I'm pleased to see so many colleagues present today. In fact, it suggests to me we should be debating this matter on the floor of the House, and I hope we will do in due course, as I will explain. I also want to give my thanks to the organisation Us For Them, who I've been working with on this and other matters, the campaign group who led the calls on behalf of children and young people during the lockdowns and are now very concerned about what this proposal might mean for the most vulnerable people in our society. Now, I acknowledge the impulse behind this treaty and the proposals that are before the World Health Alliance. I acknowledge that global threats that defy borders do require global cooperation. And it is certainly true to say that in this country we were not sufficiently prepared for the pandemic when it broke out. But I don't believe that the lack of readiness was a lack of international cooperation. Indeed, the degree of international cooperation was astonishing. I think the lack of readiness was in the ordinary business of contingency planning by the British state, the security of supply of equipment, the capacity in the health service, our ability to support the vulnerable and the isolating. That's where we weren't ready. And in fact, you could say that in a crucial respect, the UK was prepared. We thought we knew what we would do in the event of a pandemic. We thought we would introduce targeted isolation, targeted protection of the most vulnerable, the application of personal responsibility, not mass lockdowns. That wasn't part of the plan. But we threw that plan aside immediately, and we went for exactly what everybody else around the world was doing. Almost everyone. Never forget plucky Sweden. I suggest that we had an excess of global collaboration during COVID-19 and not enough independence, and certainly not enough parliamentary scrutiny. And that's why I'm very concerned about this treaty and what lies beneath it. Because the treaty simply creates the infrastructure and the funding to implement the changes that are being planned anyway via amendments to the international health regulations. And it's these amendments that are of the greater concern. These proposed new regulations will hardwire into international law and into our own domestic policy a top-down approach to pandemics and to global public health. So yes, we need cooperation. Yes, we need strategic vision. But no, we do not need ever more centralised solutions. And in fact, in this country, it wasn't the top-down approach that worked in COVID-19, from the centralised test and trace system to the food parcels for the isolating. What worked best was people taking responsibility for themselves and their neighbours, local government working with civil society, medical leaders exercising their judgment, public servants at the local level working flexibly and with initiative. What worked was not central control, but subsidiarity, decisions being taken as close as possible to the people that they affected. And now we see the World Health Organization setting itself up, not just as responsible. Happy to give way.
He's absolutely right in terms of testing, of tracing people and tracking and so on, where there was already an established infrastructure. But surely, in terms of vaccines, for example, that can only be done at a national and indeed international level.
Well, I'm all for international collaboration, including in the development of vaccines. But no, actually, I think that what we need is more independent development of medical devices and medical treatments. And in fact, it was a race between different countries that led to the vaccine programme. So, I mean, I think we have a very high degree of international collaboration at a medical level. I'm not sure we need more. So what we are seeing now, crucially, is the World Health Organization not just setting itself up as responsible for identifying pandemics, but also for the responses worldwide to those pandemics. These amendments recognise the WHO as the guiding and coordinating authority of international responses to public health emergencies of international concern. And of course, we know about the WHO, we know its unaccountable nature, the Director General appointed through an opaque, non-democratic process, too much power for international pharmaceutical companies. And these regulations propose the creation of a vast public health surveillance mechanism at public expense, but also, if the WHO itself has anything to go by, it would be substantially funded by the pharmaceutical industry. And crucially, as my friend from Don Valley just mentioned, it proposes that the existing powers for the WHO to make recommendations about what countries should do should be upgraded from non-binding to binding recommendations. So it amounts to a vast transfer of power to the WHO. And what would these new regulations enable? Legally binding obligations on countries to mandate financial contributions to fund pandemic response activities. It could require the surrender of intellectual property and technologies. It could mandate the manufacture and international sharing of vaccines. It could override national safety approval processes for vaccines, gene-based therapies, medical devices and diagnostics. How would you give way?
Thank you for giving way. Does my honourable friend agree with me that it was through the ability to react to COVID in a very agile way, which was only possible having exited the European Union at the time, that we were able to invest, procure and then roll out the vaccine that did in fact save millions of lives? And shouldn't this be a model, as he has in fact stated in his eminently sensible speech as usual, that this should be a model for moving forward?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and it's certainly the case, in my opinion, that the best aspects of the British government's response were the ones that we were able to undertake using our own sovereignty, and I agree with that. The powers for the WHO extend potentially to ordering border closures on countries, travel restrictions, tracing of contacts, refusal of entry, forced quarantining, medical examinations, including requirements for proof of vaccination, and even the forced medication of individuals. And it's not just when there is indeed a pandemic already declared that these powers might be invoked. It's when there is simply the potential for such an emergency that the WHO claims this power.
I am puzzled by this debate because I can't understand whether it is actually a debate about constitutional procedure in the House of Commons, which is whether we want more referenda. I would have thought we'd had enough of those. The UK is the second largest contributor to the WHO. This is a member-led process, so this is not an organisation that we are bit-part players in, where we're going to be directed and overrun. We cede sovereignty by membership of organisations. We cede sovereignty to go to war by being a member of NATO. This is a member-led process that, as I understand it, is to see that we're at the heart of preventing, better preparing for, and designing how we respond to future disease outbreaks. It seems to me that is perfectly logical, and I'll make one offer, as the chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee in this House, that we would want to be very much at the heart of scrutinising any future treaty that we negotiated as a member state through the WHO, and then it would go through the processes of this House before any ratification took place. Isn't that the point of the House of Commons?
Hear, hear. Well, I'm very grateful, and that's a very important contribution and suggestion by my honourable friend, and I absolutely agree. I mean, he's not totally right about the way the WHO works, of course. A simple majority of member states would approve these new regulations, and a two-thirds majority would approve the treaty. So even if we objected to it, it could still go ahead. We would then have the opportunity to opt out, which is what I suggest we do. But nevertheless, if we're talking about it, and indeed we absolutely should opt out, as I'll come to the point. I'm challenging these proposed regulations and this proposed treaty because they're wholly and fundamentally wrong, and they represent an assault on our freedoms. But we absolutely should object. And I will give way in a moment, but I just think the honourable member's suggestion is absolutely right. Fundamentally, Parliament needs to exercise its own responsibility and its own duty to oversee what we're going to do here.
And isn't the easy answer to colleagues who like this thing that we will, of course, remain members of the WHO and read its advice and accept the advice where we wish. But why should we have to accept advice when they may get it wrong and we can do nothing about it because they decide, not us?
That's absolutely right. We have the opportunity to say no to this, and that is the opportunity we need to take. Because once we've said yes, we are then under this obligation, under these obligations to introduce all of these, potentially all of these terrible infringements of liberty. I'll make some progress and let other members come in. My final real concern about the proposals are that they set the WHO up as the single source of truth on pandemics and on responses to pandemics. And there's obviously a very legitimate and understandable need to challenge misinformation and disinformation. There is a real danger there, but surely members should recognise that there's an opposite danger too, when a single agency, a single supernatural national agency becomes the sole source of information on what is true. These are the people who said that COVID-19 definitely didn't come from a lab leak, rather than from the Wuhan Institute, as now seems likely. These are the people who said that lockdowns would only be short and temporary rather than lasting the best part of 2 years, who said that vaccines stopped transmission rather than having next to no impact on transmission. They said that the vaccines would only be for the vulnerable rather than for everyone, including little babies. They said they would be voluntary rather than mandated as they were in many countries, including very nearly our own. So I don't have confidence in the WHO and its satellites to be the single source of truth, either on the science or on the response. So I'll finish with observations on Parliament. As I've just mentioned, the international health regulations, they're an existing legal instrument, so they just need a majority of member states at the World Health Alliance Assembly to be come into force. We then have 6 months to opt out of them. A treaty would require 2/3 of member states. Now, I'm very concerned about the government's response to this petition. They said that the government, I quote, supports a new legally binding instrument. So they're in favour of something along these lines. And they also say that not every treaty requires implementing legislation and it is too early to say if that would apply here. So at the moment, we're not getting a commitment from the government that they would actually bring these proposals to Parliament. And I think that is very concerning. Now, Margaret Thatcher warned in a speech in Bruges in 1988 that the UK had not helped defeat the Soviet Union just to subject itself to a new supranational arrangement, the European Union, as it became. Well, we did subject ourselves to the EU until our own time, and I suggest we didn't leave the EU just to subject ourselves to a new supranational arrangement in the form of the WHO. Now, some may find that comparison ludicrous, as they find any defence of national sovereignty, except in the case of Scotland, ludicrous. They say that in our interconnected world, we need less sovereignty and more cooperation, which means more power for people who sit above the nation-states. I say that in the modern world, we need nation-states more than ever, because only nation-states can be accountable to the people, as the WHO is not. Only nation-states can temper their policy to the particular circumstances of the people, as the WHO cannot. Only nation-states have the legitimacy and the agility to adapt to the huge threats and opportunities of our times, as the WHO cannot. Now, I firmly believe this treaty and the regulations are another and a greater threat to parliamentary sovereignty, and it's not clear if government will submit the treaty and the regulations to parliamentary approval, but I very much believe that they should, and that should be the commitment that we get from the Minister today, I hope. Thank you.
Justin Matters.